The document was sitting right on my kitchen counter. Not hidden. Not mailed in a sealed envelope. Just sitting there, face up, like it was nothing. Like what was typed on it was completely normal. Like it was a grocery list or a birthday card. I picked it up with both hands. At the top, in clean black font, were the words, "Petition for appointment of guardian, Claire Monroe. Basis, mental incapacity." My name, my mental state, signed off by a doctor I had never met once in my life. I set the paper back down. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me, because what I was reading was a legal attempt by my own parents to have me declared mentally unfit. 11 days after I buried my husband. 11 days. The ink was still fresh on Marcus's death certificate. I still could not sleep in our bedroom. I still reached for his side of the bed in the dark every single morning without thinking. And my parents, the two people who were supposed to love me more than anyone, had already hired a lawyer, found a doctor willing to lie, and set a court date. All for $4 million. My name is Claire Monroe. I am 36 years old. And what you are about to hear is the story of how I lost everything in a single moment, and then took back far more than they ever bargained for. If this story is already speaking to you, please like this video and subscribe. Drop your city and the time it is where you are. Knowing who is listening to this story genuinely means the world to me. Before I tell you what I found on that counter, you need to understand one thing. My parents never wanted me to have Marcus in the first place. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, where approval was a currency, and where my mother's silence on any given morning told you more about how your day was going to go than anything she could ever say out loud. Gerald and Diane Whitfield were not cruel people in the way that you might imagine. They did not shout. They did not throw things. They operated through something far more effective than anger. They used disappointment. A long look across the dinner table. A quiet phone call that ended just a little too abruptly. A sentence left half-finished on purpose, heavy with everything they chose not to say. I was their middle child. My older brother, Conrad, was the golden one, the one who went to Yale, who married the right woman, who called every Sunday at noon. My younger sister, Sophie, was the baby, and she moved through life with the particular ease of someone who has never been expected to prove anything. And then there was me, Claire, the one who asked too many questions, the one who wanted to study art history instead of business, the one who did not fall in love with the right person. I met Marcus Monroe at a gallery opening in the spring of my 26th year. He was standing in front of a painting that most people had walked past, and he was genuinely staring at it the way people only do when they are not performing interest for someone else. I stopped beside him. I asked him what he saw in it. He turned, looked at me with those calm, serious brown eyes, and said, "Honestly, I see someone who built something enormous and never let anyone watch them do it." I thought he was talking about the painting. He was not. Marcus was a self-made man in the truest sense of the phrase. He had grown up in a rented house in western Pennsylvania, the son of a mechanic and a school lunch worker. He had earned a full scholarship to Carnegie Mellon, built a software development firm from a 2-bedroom apartment, and by the time I met him, his company had just completed its 3rd acquisition. He was quiet about it. He drove a sensible car. He wore the same brand of watch for 11 years. My parents met him for the first time 4 months into our relationship. My father shook his hand at dinner, asked him 4 questions about his family background, and said very little for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, my mother called and told me that Marcus seemed perfectly decent, but that she was not sure we had very much in common. What she meant, and what she would never say directly, was that Marcus had not gone to the right schools, did not summer in the right places, and had not been raised inside the kind of family that her family considered worth marrying into. Marcus proposed on a Thursday morning, sitting on the floor of our apartment kitchen, eating cereal, because he said he did not want to make it a production. He said he just wanted to ask me while it was quiet, while no one else was watching, while it was just us. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My parents attended our wedding. They smiled in the photographs. My mother cried during the vows, and I allowed myself to believe, on that day, that she was crying because she was happy for me. I know better now. What I did not know on the morning of our wedding, what I had no way of knowing, was that my father had quietly done research on Marcus's estate the week after we announced our engagement. What I did not know was that he had already spoken to a financial attorney about the structure of Marcus's holdings. And what I absolutely did not know was that Gerald Whitfield had written a single line in a private journal on the evening of our wedding reception. I found that journal 3 years later. That line changed everything. The night Marcus died, my father did not call to ask how I was doing. He called to ask who had access to the accounts. Marcus died on a Wednesday morning in early April. He was 41 years old. He had never smoked, barely drank, ran 3 miles every other day. He had an annual physical every year without fail. His doctor told him each time that his numbers were excellent. He was the kind of man people describe when they talk about someone who should have had decades left. He died of a sudden cardiac arrest while sitting at his desk at 7:15 in the morning. His assistant found him when she arrived at 8. She called the paramedics first. She called me second. I remember the phone ringing and thinking, even as I reached for it, that something in the sound was different. Like the ring itself already carried the weight of what was coming. I drove to the hospital in a state that I can only describe as functional numbness. Not crying, not screaming, just moving. One red light after another. One hand on the wheel, one pressed flat against the passenger seat as though I needed to feel something solid. By the time I arrived, there was nothing the doctors could do. They were kind. They used careful language. They offered me a chair and a small cup of water and a look that I recognized as the look people wear when they have practiced delivering the worst kind of news. Marcus was gone. I sat in that hospital room with him for 2 hours before I called anyone. Not because I did not want support, but because those 2 hours were ours, and I was not ready to share them with a world that would immediately begin wanting things from me. Answers, arrangements, decisions. When I finally called my mother, the first thing she said was, "Oh, Claire. Oh, no. Does his family know?" The second thing she said, after a pause so brief most people would not have caught it, was, "Are you going to be all right managing everything on your own?" I told her I would be fine. I did not understand the question yet. My father called 20 minutes later. He asked me how I was holding up. He said all of the right things in the right order, the way a person does when they have a rough script in their head. And then, when he thought we were wrapping up the call, he said, "Is there someone with you who knows the financial situation?" Marcus had a lot of moving parts. You should not be trying to sort through all that by yourself right now. I told him I would handle it. He paused. Then he said, "Claire, you have always been emotional under pressure. There is no shame in that. But this is a complicated time, and some of these decisions, they should not be made by someone who is grieving." I told him I appreciated his concern. I hung up the phone. I sat in the parking lot of the hospital for a long time. In my chest, something had shifted. A small, cold, entirely precise recognition. The kind you do not want to be right about. The kind you push away because accepting it means accepting something so ugly about the people you love that it changes the shape of the world you thought you lived in. But I could not unknow what I had just heard in his voice. My husband was dead, and my father's mind had already moved to the money. The funeral was 8 days later. My parents arrived the morning of. My mother brought a casserole and set it on the kitchen counter with the quiet authority of someone who has decided they are in charge of a household. My father walked through the downstairs rooms slowly, looking at things the way you do when you are calculating. Not grieving. Calculating. And when the service was over and the guests had gone and the house went quiet, my father asked if he could sit down with me the following week to discuss what he called next steps. I told him I would think about it. I had no idea what those next steps already were. $4 million. That was the number on the table. And the moment everyone in that room heard it, I watched every single face change. Marcus had been organized about almost everything in his life. His finances were no exception. The meeting with his estate attorney, a composed, no-nonsense woman named Sandra Okafor, was scheduled for the Thursday following the funeral. She had already reached out to me the week of his passing to confirm that I was listed as the sole primary beneficiary across all of Marcus's holdings. She said this in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, as though it were obvious, which of course, it was. We had been married for 9 years. We had a life together. There had never been a question. What I did not expect was who showed up to that meeting. My parents arrived at Sandra's office 20 minutes early. I know this because Sandra told me herself when I walked in and found them already seated. My father in a navy blazer, my mother with a folder in her lap, which I noted and did not comment on. I sat down across the table. Sandra began. Marcus's estate, including his company shares from 2 successful exits, 2 investment properties, a brokerage account, and his life insurance policy, totaled just over $4 million. All of it, every account, every property, every share, had been left to me. There was no ambiguity, no competing claim, no codicil, no condition, no alternate beneficiary. It was iron-tight documentation prepared by a firm that had handled Marcus's affairs for over a decade. The room was quiet for a moment after Sandra finished. Then my father uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. He said, "Sandra, I want to raise something delicate." Sandra looked at him. He said, "We have genuine concerns about Claire's capacity to manage an estate of this complexity. She has been through enormous trauma. She has a history of emotional instability, and frankly, as her parents, we feel it would be irresponsible not to raise the question of whether some form of oversight might be appropriate." I looked at him. I did not speak. My mother nodded slowly beside him as though the words were a formality they had already rehearsed. Sandra looked at me and then back at my father. She said, "Mr. Whitfield, the beneficiary designation is legally clear and uncontested. This office is not in a position to take any action based on informal concerns." My father smiled. It was a pleasant smile, patient and completely certain. He said, "Of course, we understand that. We simply wanted it noted." He closed the matter there, but he had not closed it at all. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophie, my younger sister. It read, "Dad talked to Raymond Holt last week. I thought you should know. I'm sorry, Claire. I did not know what to do with that." Raymond Holt was not a family friend. He was not a financial advisor. Raymond Holt was a litigation attorney who specialized in a very specific area of law, guardianship and estate disputes. My father had hired him before the funeral was over. I sat in my car in the driveway of the house that Marcus and I had shared for 7 years. I looked at the front porch where we used to sit on summer evenings. I looked at the garden where he had planted hydrangeas for me the first spring we moved in, because I had mentioned once, in passing, that I loved them. I thought about what my father had said to Sandra, a history of emotional instability. I had never been diagnosed with anything. I had seen a therapist briefly after a miscarriage 4 years ago. I had told my mother about those sessions in a moment of vulnerability I would regret for the rest of my life. I realized in that car, in that driveway, with the hydrangeas still visible through the front window, exactly what weapon they intended to use against me. And I understood, fully and finally, that the war had already begun. I just had not started fighting yet. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday. They contained a psychiatric evaluation signed by a doctor whose name I had never seen once in my entire life. I have replayed the moment I opened that envelope many times since. It was a plain white envelope, standard size, with a return address that meant nothing to me. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter, still in the sweater I had slept in, with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter beside me. Inside was a formal court document. In the matter of Claire Monroe, petition for appointment of guardian of the person and estate. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was simple. My parents were asking a court to declare me legally incapacitated, unable to manage my own affairs, my own finances, my own decisions. If the court granted the petition, a guardian would be appointed. That guardian, the petition noted helpfully, could be a family member. My father had already suggested himself. Attached to the petition was a document that made my coffee go completely irrelevant. It was a 2-page psychiatric evaluation, formal letterhead, clinical language, detailed observations about my impaired judgment, my history of emotional dysregulation, and my demonstrated inability to manage significant responsibility under stress. At the bottom was a signature. Dr. Philip Emerson, MD, Psychiatry. I read that name 3 times. I said it out loud in my empty kitchen. I went through every memory I had of every doctor, every appointment, every waiting room I had ever sat in. I had a primary care physician I had seen for 6 years. I had a gynecologist. I had seen the grief therapist for 8 sessions the year of my miscarriage. Dr. Philip Emerson was not any of them. I had never spoken to this man. I had never sat in his office. He had never asked me a single question, taken a single note, or observed me for a single second. And yet here was his signature on a document that described my inner life in precise, damning clinical detail. I called my best friend, Nora, within the hour. Nora had been my closest friend since college, a woman who had the particular quality of being able to receive terrible news without flinching, which was exactly what I needed. I read her the evaluation over the phone, word by word. When I finished, there was a short silence. Then she said, "Claire, that is perjury. That is fraud. And it is probably criminal." I knew she was right. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it are 2 entirely different things. And the gap between them is exactly where the people who do things like this choose to operate. I spent that afternoon in my car outside the courthouse, reading everything I could find about guardianship petitions on my phone. I learned that these proceedings, when properly resourced, could move with surprising speed. I learned that the burden of proof, initially, was not enormous. I learned that a court, presented with a professional psychiatric evaluation and a family expressing genuine concern, might very well grant temporary guardianship quickly, pending a full hearing. I learned that temporary could last a very long time. I also learned something else, something my father had clearly calculated on. Guardianship hearings are not criminal trials, they are civil proceedings. And in a civil proceeding, the person being declared incapacitated is often the one who must fight hardest to prove a negative, to prove that they are not what someone else is claiming they are. The burden of sanity, it turns out, is heavier than it sounds. That evening, my father called. He used his gentle voice, the one I had known since childhood, the one that meant he was already certain of the outcome. He said, "Claire, this is not about punishment. This is about making sure you are protected. You are grieving. You are vulnerable. The estate is complicated. We just want to help." I said, "I know, Dad." I said nothing else. But when I hung up, I opened the Notes app on my phone and I typed a single line, the first entry in what would eventually become the document that brought the entire plan crashing down. I told you earlier that my father had written something in a private journal on the night of my wedding. Now I am going to tell you what it said. After Marcus died, I spent 3 days going through his home office, organizing documents for the estate attorney. Marcus was meticulous. Labeled files, dated folders, everything in order. It was both a comfort and a small agony to move through the architecture of his careful mind while he was no longer in the world to see me do it. On the third day, I found the envelope. It was tucked inside the back cover of a hardback book on Marcus's shelf, the kind of place something gets put not to hide it, but to keep it safe and separate. The envelope had my name on the outside, Marcus's handwriting. Inside was a folded note and a small flash drive. The note, in Marcus's precise, unhurried handwriting, said, "Claire, if you are reading this without me beside you, then the thing I was afraid of has happened. I should have told you about this sooner. I am sorry that I did not. Everything you need is on the drive. I trust you completely. I always have. M." I do not think I breathed for a full minute after reading that. I plugged the drive into my laptop. There were 3 folders. The first folder contained financial records, wire transfers from my father's personal account to an account I did not recognize, starting 6 years ago and continuing in irregular intervals right up to 3 months before Marcus died. The amounts varied between $1,500 and $8,000 each time. The account receiving the funds was registered to a company called Meridian Advisory Group, LLC. I searched that company name. Meridian Advisory Group, LLC, had one registered officer, Raymond Holt. My father had been quietly paying Marcus's eventual adversary for 6 years, not in anticipation of Marcus's death specifically, but in readiness for the moment my parents decided to make their move. Raymond Holt had not been a last-minute hire. He had been a long-term investment. The second folder contained photographs. They were screenshots of text messages between my father and a man identified in the contact as P.E. In one exchange, my father wrote, "The evaluation needs to be thorough enough to hold up in an initial hearing. You will be paid the balance on filing." The response was, "Understood. I will use the file you provided. Give me 2 weeks." P.E. Dr. Philip Emerson. My father had provided Dr. Emerson with a file, likely every scrap of personal information he could compile about me, including whatever he had extracted from my mother over the years, including my 8 therapy sessions after the miscarriage, including whatever convenient version of my history he had constructed, and paid him to build a psychiatric evaluation out of it. A psychiatric evaluation for a patient he had never seen. The third folder contained the journal entry. Marcus had photographed it. The image was clear. My father's handwriting on a cream-colored page, dated the evening of our wedding. It read, "She has no idea what she is marrying into. He has no family money, no network, and no heirs beyond her. If anything happens to him before they have children, it all reverts. She will not know how to manage it. She will need guidance. We will be there to provide it." That word, reverts. My father had been thinking about Marcus's estate before I had even said my vows. I sat on the floor of Marcus's office for a long time. Around me were the files and folders of the life he had built with such quiet, deliberate care. The hydrangeas outside the window. The coffee mug he had left on the corner of the desk that I still had not moved. I thought about what Marcus had written. "I trust you completely. I always have." I made a decision in that moment. I was not going to defend myself in a courtroom. I was going to burn their entire plan to the ground, and I already had exactly what I needed to do it. I had the evidence, but evidence without the right people in the right places is just paper. I needed to build something they could not walk away from. The first call I made was to David Chen. David was a civil litigation and estate attorney based in the city, and his name had come to me through Sandra Okafor, who had looked me straight in the eye when we last spoke, and said, "Claire, you need someone who fights." She did not say anything more than that. She did not need to. I called David on a Friday morning. He picked up himself. No assistant, no hold music. I told him in 10 minutes what I had found, what my parents had filed, and what was on the flash drive. He listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Can you be in my office Monday morning?" I was there at 8:15. David Chen was not a theatrical man. He did not do dramatic pauses or practiced expressions of outrage. He reviewed the flash drive contents with the methodical attention of someone who had seen a great many ugly things done with a great deal of money and had learned not to be surprised. When he finished going through the files, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Claire, this is not just a guardianship defense. What your father has done constitutes fraud on the court, conspiracy, and potentially subornation of perjury depending on what Emerson knew and when." He said, "This does not end with your parents losing the petition. This ends with them facing criminal referrals." I told him that was exactly what I wanted. David began filing the paperwork the same week, a formal response to the guardianship petition, including a motion to dismiss based on the fraudulent nature of the psychiatric evaluation. He also filed a subpoena for Dr. Philip Emerson's professional records and license history. What came back was illuminating. Dr. Emerson had a license, but his practice had been under review by the state medical board twice in the previous 4 years for what was described vaguely in the public record as documentation irregularities. He had never testified in any guardianship case before. He had no published peer-reviewed work. He had, according to the address listed on his letterhead, an office in a building that turned out to be a shared co-working space rented by the hour. He was not a distinguished psychiatrist. He was a man with a credential and a willingness to use it incorrectly in exchange for money. Meanwhile, Sophie called me again. My younger sister had always been the quiet one, the one who drifted along the edges of our family's dynamics without ever fully inserting herself into the center. I had sometimes resented her for that, standing back while things happened, not intervening. But now she called me from her car, speaking in a low voice, and told me something that made my breath catch. She said, "Dad made me sign something, about 3 weeks ago. A consent form," he said, "for the petition. He told me it was just a formality, that it was about protecting you. He had it already." I signed it. "Claire, I am so sorry. I did not read it properly. I did not understand what I was signing." I asked her if she would be willing to put that in writing, that she had been misled, that she had not understood the true nature of the document, that she had signed under false pretenses. She said yes, without hesitating. Sophie became my second witness. Nora, who had a background in forensic accounting from a previous career in banking, spent 2 weekends going through the wire transfer records with me, building a clear, annotated timeline of every payment from my father to Raymond Holt's company. She printed it in a clean, readable format and signed a declaration attesting to the methodology she had used to compile it. By the time the court date arrived, I had a flash drive full of damning evidence, a forensic financial timeline, a corrupted doctor with a paper trail, a misled sister willing to testify, and an attorney who had made it very clear that we were not going to this hearing to play defense. We were going there to end it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. My father arrived in a charcoal suit. He brought flowers for the lobby receptionist. He shook hands with every person who would look at him. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. Probate court has a particular atmosphere. It is quieter than a criminal courtroom, less charged on the surface, and people underestimate it because of that. They think it is a room where paperwork changes hands and judges sign forms. They think it is a place where the loudest voice wins. My father thought that too. Raymond Holt opened for the petitioners. He was polished, articulate, and completely without warmth. He painted a portrait of a grieving widow, overwhelmed, emotionally fragile, demonstrably unequipped for the management of a $4 million estate. He referenced my therapy sessions. He referenced what he described as a pattern of poor judgment under emotional stress. He cited the psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Emerson as objective clinical evidence. He was very good at his job. I will acknowledge that. He structured the narrative carefully and credibly, the way someone does when they have been building toward a moment for a long time. My mother sat in the gallery in a pale blue cardigan, her hands folded in her lap, her expression practiced and sorrowful. She looked like grief. She looked like a mother who loved her daughter and was doing a painful, necessary thing. My father sat slightly forward in his chair, the posture of a man who is not nervous because he is certain of the outcome. The judge, a woman named Honorable Reyes, listened to Holt's opening without expression. She was methodical and precise. She asked 3 clarifying questions about the timeline of the petition filing and 2 about the qualifications of the evaluating psychiatrist. When Holt finished, she looked at David Chen. David stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we will be introducing evidence today that the psychiatric evaluation submitted by the petitioners was produced without any in-person examination of my client, signed by a physician with no valid clinical relationship to her, and paid for by the petitioner himself in advance of any concern about my client's fitness." He let that land. Then he said, "We will further demonstrate that the petition itself was filed as part of a coordinated, years-long effort by the petitioners to position themselves to access the estate of my client's late husband, beginning as early as the year of my client's marriage." A sound moved through the gallery, small, brief, involuntary. Holt was on his feet with an objection before David had finished the sentence. Judge Reyes raised one hand and Holt sat down. She said, "Mr. Chen, you are describing predicate fraud. I assume you intend to substantiate that." David said, "Yes, Your Honor, in considerable detail." My father turned to Holt and said something I could not hear. Holt leaned in and said something back. My father's face did not change, but his jaw tightened in a way that I recognized from childhood. That was what he looked like when something had not gone the way he expected. My mother looked at her hands. During the first recess, a court officer approached me in the hallway and told me that Dr. Philip Emerson had contacted the court that morning to say that he would not be appearing as a witness. He had submitted a brief, written statement instead, through a personal attorney, which stated that he believed his professional opinion had been provided in good faith, but that he wished to clarify the conditions under which it had been produced. He was already beginning to distance himself from my father. David read the statement over my shoulder in the hallway. He looked up at me with the closest thing to a smile his courtroom face ever produced. He said, "They just lost their only clinical witness." I nodded. I looked back through the courtroom window at my father, who was now speaking in low, rapid sentences to Holt, his hand flat on the table, his composure beginning, for the very first time, to show its seams. I had waited 36 years to see that. Tomorrow, no, in the next hour, that would look considerably worse for him. David Chen stood up after recess, placed a single folder on the table, and said 5 words that changed everything in that courtroom. "Your Honor, I have exhibits." The exhibits came in 3 waves, and David had structured them deliberately. He did not front-load everything. He built toward the worst of it the way you build toward the conclusion of an argument, each piece more damning than the last, each one arriving just as the courtroom had absorbed the previous shock. The first exhibit was the payment records. Nora's annotated financial timeline went up on the courtroom monitor. Every wire transfer from my father's personal account to Meridian Advisory Group LLC laid out in clean, dated columns. 6 years of payments to Raymond Holt's company. David asked my father's attorney to explain the business relationship between his client and the petitioner's legal representative. Holt had no explanation. David moved to the second exhibit. The text message screenshots from the second folder on Marcus's flash drive came up next. The exchange between my father and Dr. Emerson. The evaluation needs to be thorough enough to hold up in an initial hearing. You will be paid the balance on filing. The response confirming receipt and method. Judge Reyes read them twice. She looked at Holt. She said, "Counsel, is your client prepared to address these communications?" Holt asked for a recess. Judge Reyes denied it. The third exhibit was Sophie. My sister took the stand in a gray dress, her hands steady on the arm of the chair, her eyes not on my parents but on the judge. She described the morning my father had presented her with the consent form. She described what he had told her it was for. She described her genuine belief that she was signing something routine and protective. Then she said, "I would like the court to know that my sister is one of the most capable, clear-minded people I have ever known. She was my brother-in-law's equal in every way. What my father is claiming about her is not who she is. It is who he needs her to be so that this works." My mother let out a small, audible sound from the gallery. My father stared at Sophie with an expression I had never seen on his face before in my life. It was not anger. It was not hurt. It was the look of someone recalculating, in real time, where the exit was. David requested that the court take judicial notice of the state medical board's records on Dr. Emerson. The documentation irregularities, the absence of any legitimate clinical history with me, the hourly co-working space address listed on his professional letterhead. Then David introduced the final piece. He had reached out quietly, 2 weeks earlier, to 3 of Marcus's former business colleagues who had known him for over a decade. Each one had provided a written declaration attesting to the health, stability, and full competency of Marcus Monroe in the years preceding his death. And each one included a statement about me, about my involvement in Marcus's business decisions, my judgment, my clarity, my presence at key moments in the company's history. They were building the picture of who I actually was, against the picture my father had paid someone to paint of me. When David sat down, the courtroom was quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when something has shifted so completely that no one quite knows how to continue. Judge Reyes looked at my father for a long moment. Then she looked at Holt. She said, "Mr. Holt, before I address the petition, I want to know whether your client intends to maintain the submission of the Emerson evaluation as legitimate clinical evidence." Holt straightened his tie. He said he would need to confer with his client. He leaned over to my father. My father said something. Holt shook his head slightly. My father said something else. Then Holt looked up at Judge Reyes, and the expression on his face told me, before a single word left his mouth, that the next thing he said was going to be the thing that ended this for all of them. Raymond Holt withdrew the petition. But that was not the end. That was, in fact, just the beginning of what happened to every single person in that room who had played a part in this plan. Raymond Holt stood, smoothed his jacket, and told the court that the petitioners were voluntarily withdrawing the guardianship petition, effective immediately. He said it in the flat, practiced tone of a man who has made a professional calculation. He was not surrendering out of conscience. He was cutting the clean way out before the room got worse. Attorneys think about their own licenses. Raymond Holt was thinking about his license. Judge Reyes accepted the withdrawal. Then she did something Raymond Holt had not accounted for. She looked directly at the petitioner's table and said, "The court notes for the record that the evidence presented today raises serious questions regarding the integrity of the submitted psychiatric evaluation and the circumstances under which this petition was filed. These materials are being referred to the County District Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud, conspiracy, and subornation of perjury. This referral is effective immediately. My mother began crying quietly in the gallery. My father sat very still. I did not feel satisfaction in that moment, not the clean, triumphant kind people imagine when they think about justice. What I felt was something more complicated, a quiet, absolute clarity, like a noise I had been hearing for years had finally, suddenly stopped. Outside the courthouse, David Chen shook my hand and told me that the DA's referral was significant. It meant an investigator would be assigned. It meant Emerson's records would be subpoenaed. It meant that the payments to Raymond Holt's company would be examined in a criminal context. He said that the likely outcomes, based on the evidence on the flash drive, ranged from financial penalties to actual prosecution. He was right on both counts. Dr. Philip Emerson surrendered his medical license voluntarily 4 weeks after the hearing, before the medical board could move to revoke it. He cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. What he told them about how the evaluation had been commissioned, what information he had been given, and what he had been paid was submitted to the DA's office and became the core of the criminal referral. Raymond Holt received a formal disciplinary complaint filed with the state bar. The financial records showing years of payments predating the guardianship petition were particularly damaging to his claim that his representation had been independent and in good faith. His license was suspended pending investigation. My father, Gerald Whitfield, was charged with fraud on the court, conspiracy, and 1 count related to the solicitation of false professional testimony. The criminal proceedings were separate from the civil and probate matters, and I will not pretend they were swift. They were not. The legal process is slow and grinding and often feels, in the middle of it, like it is moving in the wrong direction. But a year and 3 months after that courtroom morning, my father stood before a judge and entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge in exchange for a substantial fine, mandatory community service, and a period of supervised probation. He did not look at me when he entered the plea. I was there. I wanted to be there, not out of cruelty, but because I had earned the right to witness the moment. Marcus's estate remained entirely in my hands throughout the process. Sandra Okafor confirmed the final transfer of all accounts and property into my name within 60 days of the guardianship petition being withdrawn. The $4 million that my father had wanted to control, that my mother had quietly helped maneuver toward, that a fraudulent doctor had signed his name to help steal. It was mine, fully, legally, completely. I sold one of the investment properties and set up a scholarship fund in Marcus's name at Carnegie Mellon, the school that had changed the direction of his life. I kept the house on Elm Terrace. The hydrangeas Marcus planted are still in the garden. Every April, when they come back, I sit on the porch in the morning and I think about what he wrote to me on that flash drive. I trust you completely. I always have. He was right to. When I look back at everything, the funeral, the petition, the courtroom, the verdict, I do not think the most important part of this story is the money. The most important part is the moment I decided not to shrink. My father had counted on one thing above all else. He had counted on me being too devastated, too destabilized, and too alone to fight. He had constructed an entire legal architecture on the assumption that grief would make me passive. He did not know that Marcus had trusted me with everything I needed to survive it. He did not know that the people who underestimate you hand you the most powerful weapon available. Because when you refuse to be what they have already decided you are, everything they built to contain you becomes the evidence against them. I am not defined by what they tried to do to me. I am defined by what I did next. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, Please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. These are real human experiences. They deserve to be heard. The next story coming to this channel is one you will not be able to stop watching.